My name is Mackenzie. And for most of my life, I was the person in the room that no one really looked at twice. Not because I was hiding, but because no one thought there was anything worth noticing. I was always there, always present, always listening, but somehow, always invisible. Being in the background doesn't mean you're forgotten entirely. It means you're remembered in fragments. You're the one people vaguely mention in passing, the one they assign roles to based on outdated versions of you they never updated. You become a concept more than a person, someone quiet, someone plain, someone who doesn't make waves. And when people have already decided who you are, they stop asking. There was never a point when anyone said outright that I didn't matter, but the silence said it enough. The way my ideas were passed over, the way my accomplishments were mentioned, briefly if at all, while others were praised for less. The way my presence was never really questioned if I wasn't there. That's what background feels like. You're not disliked, you're just dispensable, and it doesn't happen all at once. It's built over years. 1,000 small dismissals. The times you speak and no one listens. The moments when others are greeted with excitement, and you get a glance and a nod. The subtle shift in tone when the conversation moves to someone else. The repeated reminder that in the architecture of your family, you are not a central pillar. You are a sidewall. Supporting, but easily replaceable. It's not that I didn't have thoughts, talents, or dreams. I just wasn't the one anyone expected anything big from. I wasn't the golden child. I wasn't the problem child either. I was the neutral zone, the one who got overlooked because I made it easy not to look. When you're raised to not need much, people stop offering. When you never cause trouble, people stop checking in. There's a strange kind of exhaustion in being the reliable one, the unproblematic one. You start to realize that peace can also become erasure. That being easy to be around means people assume you don't have depth. That when you never demand space, no one thinks you deserve any. Holidays, like Thanksgiving, made it more obvious. Those were the times when roles became performance. The loud ones were loud. The admired ones were praised. The favored ones were catered to. And I floated around, helping where needed, laughing when appropriate, smiling politely even when ignored. You learn how to become a mirror reflecting back what others expect to see, never disrupting the frame. There's a difference between being loved and being valued. Love, in many families, is automatic. It's declared, expected, assumed. But value, that's something else. Value is felt when people are curious about your voice. When they celebrate your wins without needing to compare them. When they remember what matters to you not because it's impressive, but because it's you. And that kind of value was something I learned to live without. I was never bitter, at least not at first. You rationalize it. You tell yourself everyone has a role. You convince yourself that being quiet is noble. That being unnoticed means you're doing life right, smooth, simple, undramatic. But eventually, it wears thin. You start to ask, if I disappeared, what would change? If I stopped trying, who would notice? You realize you've spent years making other people comfortable in rooms where you never felt seen, and yet I didn't rebel. I didn't shout. I didn't try to take the spotlight. That was never my way. Instead, I chose to build myself quietly. I chose to invest inward while they all looked outward. While they performed, I prepared. While they looked for attention, I looked for foundation. While they made assumptions, I made progress. Not for them, for me. But that's the irony of being in the background. When you finally step forward, when something undeniable about you rises to the surface, people act surprised, shocked that the quiet one was building something all along. And then suddenly, the absence of attention becomes a hunger for access. They didn't ask how I got there. They asked what I could now give. But that part comes later. This part, that before, was the long, lonely stretch of becoming. Of watching others be seen while I learned how to see myself. Of recognizing that invisibility wasn't my choice but growth. Quietly, definitely, was. Asterisk, 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 there is a specific moment when perception shifts. It is rarely announced directly. It shows itself in glances that linger too long, in voices that soften unexpectedly, in attention that suddenly becomes selective in your direction. The revelation doesn't need to be dramatic for its consequences to echo. When money enters a room where you were previously ignored, something unspoken begins to speak louder than any truth you've shared before. Wealth doesn't just elevate your resources, it exposes the relationships around you. The revelation that I had $15 million didn't come with celebration. It came with curiosity first, then calculation. People who had barely acknowledged my presence at the table began to take mental inventory of what I might offer. It wasn't about MIT, was about access. I was no longer just Mackenzie. I had become something else, entirely. A financial possibility. A newly unlocked door in a house they thought they knew. Money doesn't change who you are. It changes who people let themselves be around you. And that shift is subtle at first. The conversation becomes more polite, more focused, less dismissive. Jokes that once cut too close are suddenly filtered. Eyes that once passed over you now make contact, a little too often. The family that once forgot your birthday now remembers details about your life they never asked about before. But underneath the attention is a question they won't say out loud. What can you give me now? You begin to feel a strange mix of validation and alienation. For so long, you wished they'd look at you. Now that they do, you wonder if it's really you they're seeing or the number attached to your name. You question if the sudden interest is a reflection of your growth or a reaction to their own scarcity. You feel the warmth, but it burns different now, because you're not sure if it's real. Wealth magnifies intention. Those who loved you before want nothing from you. Their energy doesn't shift. Their tone doesn't bend. But those who overlooked you before now see opportunity, not reconciliation. Their interest is layered with expectation. Their praise sounds rehearsed. Their admiration feels transactional. You start to feel like an unspoken contract is being drawn around you, with invisible terms. If you are successful, then you owe us something. And maybe they don't say it, but they act it. The way they lean in when you speak, but only when it's about your career. The way they compliment your choices, but offer none of the depth you needed when you were struggling. The way they recall your childhood with revisionist memory, painting themselves as supportive, involved, proud when they were silent, absent, or dismissive. You see the reconstruction happen in real time. You become the family success story they claim, even if they never helped build it. It is disorienting. You want to believe in the sincerity of their newfound closeness. You want to believe that the money is irrelevant, that the connection is genuine, that the shift is just timing, not convenience. But the patterns tell you otherwise. The patterns reveal who called, who didn't, who asked how you were, and who asked what you could do. This is where the internal tension begins, the conflict between gratitude and boundaries. You've worked hard. You've grown. You're not ashamed of your wealth. But you never wanted it to be a ticket into respect. You never wanted it to buy the acknowledgement you should have received freely. You didn't change, they did. And now, their behavior makes you question what was real all along. Because wealth, while silent, speaks volumes in the way people approach you. And when you've gone from invisible to important overnight, not because you found your voice, but because they found out your net worth, it doesn't feel like recognition. It feels like exposure. When people learn that you have more than they expected, they don't always congratulate you. Sometimes, they begin to calculate you. The moment your success becomes visible, it also becomes negotiable in the eyes of others. What was once yours suddenly feels like something they believe they deserve a piece of simply because they were there, even if they were never truly with you. Since you have it, becomes the quiet, dangerous beginning of entitlement. It rarely starts with a demand. It starts with a suggestion, a hint, a joke layered with intent, a question dressed as casual conversation. At first, it feels harmless, someone asking if you've thought about investing in a family member's business, or if you could help cover a small need. The language is soft, but the expectation is not. The underlying message becomes clear. Now that you've made it, it's time to share it. What no one acknowledges is how lonely success becomes when it is interpreted as a debt. Suddenly, generosity isn't a choice, it's an obligation. Your wealth is no longer seen as a personal result of hard work, risk, and sacrifice. It's seen as a communal asset that needs to be redistributed to make others feel better about their own decisions, struggles, or lack of progress. They reframe your success as something that should now benefit everyone, without ever asking what it cost you to build it. There is an emotional transaction that starts to unfold, often in silence. You are positioned not as a person, but as a provider. Your emotional availability becomes secondary to your financial capacity. People no longer ask how you are, they ask what you can do. They wrap their requests in stories of hardship, nostalgia, or loyalty. They remind you of childhood memories. They reference sacrifices that were never theirs. They reconstruct narratives to align themselves with your journey, even if they walked beside it in absence or indifference. You begin to feel the pressure of emotional blackmail. They use phrases like "we're family. You wouldn't be where you are without us, or just a small favor. They imply guilt if you hesitate. They twist your boundaries into selfishness. They treat your no as betrayal, your silence as arrogance, your protection as pride. What they don't see or refuse to see is that your wealth did not erase your humanity. It did not make you a machine. It did not give them ownership over your peace. The weight of these demands becomes invisible, yet constant. You carry the responsibility of saying no with grace, knowing it may cost you the relationship. You carry the burden of being misunderstood because you refuse to be manipulated. You carry the ache of realizing that your success didn't bring celebration, it brought expectation. And that expectation doesn't just come from one person, it spreads like wildfire. The more you give, the more they believe you will. The less you give, the more they resent. And so, you stand in a strange space, where giving feels like loss, and withholding feels like guilt. They never saw you as the one who could become what you are now. But now that you are, they position themselves as part of the story. They speak of you with pride when it benefits them. They use your name as currency in conversations. They treat your decisions as public business. They confuse access with ownership. What they forget is that access is earned. It is not granted simply through relation or proximity. You begin to see the difference between family and entitlement, between love and leverage, between support and strategy. You learn that some people don't want you to be free, they want you to be useful. And once you are no longer useful to them, their warmth fades, their presence dims, their narrative shifts. They say you changed. What they mean is, you stopped giving them what they expected. They call you distant. What they mean is, you drew a boundary they didn't approve of. They say you forgot where you came from. What they mean is, you no longer tolerate being emotionally extorted in the name of tradition or blood. And as this truth settles in, something else rises in you, a fierce clarity. Clarity that your worth is not transactional. That your success does not need to be diluted to maintain relationships. That generosity must come from overflow, not obligation. That you are not a villain for protecting the life you built. Asterisk, 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 there is a moment when silence becomes more powerful than explanation. When your decision not to respond, not to justify, not to argue becomes the clearest expression of your growth, because you finally understand. People who are committed to misunderstanding you will not be satisfied by your reasons. They will not honor your clarity. They will only weaponize your vulnerability as a way to guilt you back into the space you've already outgrown. That's when you realize, your boundaries are not betrayal, they are repair. When you've spent your life being easy to reach, always available, always accommodating, people begin to believe that access is their right. The moment you choose a limit, they call it selfish. The moment you protect your peace, they call it pride. The moment you step out of the role they cast for you, they act like you're breaking the script, not realizing that you never agreed to the part they assigned in the first place. Setting boundaries is not rejection, it's remembering that you are not required to disappear in order to be loved. The challenge, however, is emotional. It's not just about saying no, it's about enduring the emotional storms that follow. The coldness, the passive aggression, the silence that isn't just distance, but a demand. Give in, or we'll withdraw our affection. That is the emotional blackmail behind so many family dynamics. It's not loud, it's not cruel on the surface, but it is clear. Love will now be conditional. You begin to feel the pressure of choosing between two kinds of loss. If you give in, you lose your boundaries. You lose the part of yourself that fought to be free. You continue the cycle of quiet resentment, of being needed but never seen. If you hold the boundary, you lose connection, or at least the illusion of it. You risk being labeled distant, ungrateful, even cold. You risk being talked about in rooms you're not invited into anymore. You risk being remembered not for what you gave, but for what you refused. This is the price of self-preservation, misunderstood peace, but slowly, you begin to understand that not every relationship can go with you into your healing. Some relationships exist only in the absence of boundaries. The moment you claim your full self, the contract breaks because it was never built on mutual respect. It was built on silence, on compliance, on the unspoken agreement that you would keep showing up in ways that cost you more than you could afford to give. When you stop upholding that agreement, people don't just resist you, reveal them. You reveal how fragile the connection really was. You reveal how deeply they relied on your silence. You reveal the parts of them that needed your subservience to feel secure. And it hurts not because you want their approval, but because part of you still grieves the idea that love should come without conditions. But grief does not mean you were wrong. It means you're healing from the story you were told about what love is supposed to feel like. Real love does not punish boundaries. Real love honors them. So you begin to stand still, even when it's quiet, even when the calls stop, even when the messages are left unread. You stop over-explaining. You stop justifying. You stop trying to translate your truth into a language they've never cared to learn. Instead, you root deeper into the kind of peace that doesn't ask for permission to exist. You learn how to survive the discomfort of being the one who changes. Because change isn't always welcomed. Sometimes it's treated as betrayal. Especially when your change reminds others of their stagnancy. Your growth becomes a mirror. Your voice becomes disruptive. Your boundaries become threatening. Not because they are wrong, but because they reveal what others are unwilling to confront in themselves. Still, you choose peace, because peace built on boundaries is better than connection built on fear. Because respect that costs you your freedom isn't respect, it's control. Because being understood is not worth being used. And because any relationship that dies in the presence of your truth was never built on love. It was built on your ability to endure silence. There is a different kind of clarity that emerges in the aftermath, not in the moment you say no, but in the silence that follows. It is in that quiet, in the absence of access, that you learn who they truly were, not who they pretended to be. In your presence, not who they claimed to be when benefits were flowing, but who they become when you are no longer useful. That is when masks fall. That is when truth reveals itself, not in confrontation, but in distance. When access is gone, entitlement either dissolves or hardens. Those who only saw you as a source begin to withdraw. They no longer reach out, not because they are hurt but because the transaction has ended. You see them not grieving the relationship, but grieving the benefits. Their silence is not a wound, it is a mirror, a reflection of what your presence meant to them all along. You begin to recognize the difference between loyalty and dependency. Loyalty remains in stillness. Dependency vanishes in drought. And what's left is not a broken bond, it's a broken illusion. When you stop giving, not because you're selfish, but because you've reached your threshold, those who believed they were entitled to your energy will often claim you've changed. They will say you became cold, distant, unreachable. But that story is a shield away for them to avoid facing the reality that they were never there for you. They were there for what you could do. It is sobering to realize how many relationships were built on convenience. You begin to feel a strange kind of grief, not for what you lost, but for what never really existed. You grieve the illusion of support, the fantasy of closeness, the belief that being family was enough to ensure mutual care. You mourn the years you spent trying to earn love through giving. And now, in the absence of demand, you finally begin to feel something close to peace. Not immediate peace, not easy peace, but honest peace, the kind of peace that doesn't come from being understood, but from understanding yourself. The kind that doesn't need validation, because it is rooted in the kind that doesn't fear being alone, because it finally recognizes the cost of being surrounded by people who only stayed close for access. And in that space, you stop reaching back, not because you're angry, not because you're bitter, but because you've seen what proximity without integrity really looks like. You've seen how quickly people become strangers when boundaries arrive. You've seen how love that demands your silence is not love, it's control. You've seen how people rewrite history to make you the villain in their story. Simply because you stopped playing your assigned part. There is no need to defend yourself anymore. Distance does the talking for you. Those who still love you don't vanish when the giving stops. They don't question your worth when your wallet is closed. They don't measure your value in usefulness. They remain. Maybe not loudly, maybe not daily, but steadily. And that steadiness, in a world of conditional love, is sacred. You begin to reorient your life around these truths. You invest in the relationships that are mutual. You protect your time like a currency. You treat peace as a priority, not a privilege. You say no without apology. You let people walk away without chasing them. You understand that not every silence needs to be filled. Some silences are answers. And in this clarity, your life becomes quieter but also deeper, because when you remove those who only stayed for access, you make space for those who show up for connection, not for gain, not for status, not for advantage, but simply to witness, support, and share space. And those people may be fewer in number, but their presence is heavier with meaning. What you lost in quantity, you gained in authenticity. This is the beauty of life after boundaries, the revelation that access was never the goal. Alignment was. You no longer confuse being surrounded with being seen. You no longer chase understanding from people committed to distortion. You no longer explain your evolution to those who decided who you were years ago and never updated the file. You simply live, fully, freely. Finally, when the noise fades, you start to hear your own voice again, not the version of yourself shaped by expectations or guilt. Not the voice rehearsed to sound palatable to those who never truly listened, but the raw, honest voice you silenced to maintain peace that was never mutual. And in that rediscovery, something radical begins to grow. Trust. Not in others, but in yourself. You begin to trust your instincts. When they say someone's intentions are conditional, you trust your discomfort when a conversation feels performative. You trust your need for space without labeling it selfish. You trust that your boundaries do not make you unkind, they make you conscious. The version of you that once chased validation no longer runs. Because you know now that not all silence is rejection. Some silence is relief. Not all distance is a fracture. Some distance is alignment. Not all endings are failures. Some endings are freedom. The people who walk away when the giving stops were never truly with you. They were with what you provided. And when that provision ends, their departure isn't abandonment, it's revelation. It's the clarity you didn't know you needed. The permission you were afraid to claim. The evidence you were right to protect your peace. Letting them go becomes less painful when you realize what staying cost you. You begin to see how often you betrayed yourself just to be accepted. How many times you said yes when your soul said no. How frequently you absorbed their moods, their needs, their expectations, while yours went unattended. How long you confused people-pleasing with loyalty, self-sacrifice with love. Now, without access, they can no longer drain you. No longer twist your care into obligation. No longer interpret your presence as ownership. Without access, they are left with only their reflection, and you are left with only your truth. That truth is heavy, but it heals. It teaches you how to rebuild connection on your terms, how to discern between invitation and intrusion, how to live in integrity with yourself, even when it costs you comfort. It teaches you how to disappoint others without destroying your spirit. It teaches you how to leave rooms where your worth was always conditional. And slowly, the emptiness that follows those exits begins to feel like expansion. You find that your life is not smaller without them. It's cleaner, quieter, more honest. You're no longer carrying relationships out of guilt. You're no longer managing the expectations of people who never managed to truly see you. You're no longer explaining your peace like it's something to be debated. You are simply living it, and that is the ultimate transformation. When peace is no longer a performance, but a posture, a way of standing in yourself, fully, without apology, a way of being in the world that no longer relies on others to define your worth. The people who can't handle your peace without access were never aligned with your truth, and the people who remain not for what you can give, but for who you are become more than support. They become soul-level companions, because they don't love you for the access, they love you for the alignment. Healing isn't always loud. Sometimes, healing looks like not responding to a message that once would have sent you spiraling. Sometimes, it's staying quiet when provoked because you finally understand that your silence isn't sovereignty. Sometimes, healing is simply the decision to no longer hand your energy to people who only noticed you when it benefited them. And the further you move away from being accessible to everyone, the more you realize how expensive it was to always be available. There is an emotional cost to overextending yourself in the name of connection. You pay for it in anxiety, in resentment, in the quiet ache of being surrounded by people who don't actually know you, but who think they own some part of you because of shared history, shared blood, or shared expectations. When you take that access back, you begin to see clearly who respected you and who merely tolerated you. Tolerance is quiet control. It looks like politeness but feels like pressure. It sounds like support but comes with strings. It's the performance of presence, not the practice of care. And when you stop giving to those who only tolerated you, you realize how transactional their presence always was. You no longer feel responsible for managing other people's discomfort with your boundaries. You no longer believe that peace means pleasing everyone. You no longer apologize for putting yourself first when your well-being is on the line. Instead, you begin to live from a different place, one where your time, your presence, your generosity are all intentional, not reactive, not guilt-driven. not shaped by fear of abandonment, but grounded in alignment, honesty, and discernment. And, slowly, the fear that you will lose people becomes smaller than the fear that you will lose yourself again. Because you know now what that loss feels like. You've lived through the erosion of self that comes from chronic overgiving. You've experienced the emotional debt of being everyone's emotional safety net. And you've learned that survival is not the same as fulfillment. That being needed is not the same as being seen. That being praised is not the same as being protected. What you're building now is not a reaction, it's a reclamation. Reclaiming your identity from the roles others wrote for you. Reclaiming your energy from relationships that never refueled you. Reclaiming your story from narratives that painted you as selfish simply because you stopped being self-erasing. You start to see boundaries not as walls, but as windows, clear lines that let in what is true and keep out what distorts you. Stop negotiating with guilt and start dialoguing with purpose. You begin to move through the world with less weight, not because life is easier, but because you're no longer carrying other people's comfort as your responsibility. And what remains after the noise? After the silence, after the withdrawal is clarity, quiet, sturdy, unshakable clarity. Asterisk, 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 there comes a point in the aftermath where you no longer scan the room for missing voices. You stop checking your phone for apologies that never arrive. You stop revisiting conversations in your mind, rehearsing what you could have said to make them understand. Because understanding is no longer your currency, peace is. You begin to recognize that peace is not a place you arrive at. It's a practice you commit to. A discipline that reshapes the way you engage with yourself and with others. And in that practice, you stop needing people to validate your truth in order for it to remain true. The people who distanced themselves after losing access are not your burden to carry. Their absence is not your failure. It is their response to a reality they didn't expect, that you no longer exist to serve their comfort. That you no longer perform the version of yourself they preferred. That you are no longer emotionally available on demand. And when you release yourself from the pressure to fix, to please, to explain, you create space for something rare. Dignity. Dignity doesn't argue. It doesn't beg. It doesn't overextend. Dignity stands firm in what is real. It honors your growth without diminishing their struggle. It chooses presence over performance. It loves deeply, but never at the cost of self-abandonment. This is what remains when access is removed, the opportunity to live. In emotional integrity, you are no longer who you were when they last had full access to you. You're no longer emotionally stretched thin. You're no longer bargaining with your self-worth in the name of loyalty. You're no longer afraid of losing people who never really saw you to begin with, and slowly, you start building a life that reflects that. A life where relationships are rooted in reciprocity, not routine. A life where your presence is not assumed, but appreciated. A life where generosity flows from a full cup, not a fractured identity. A life where being misunderstood doesn't shake your foundation because your foundation no longer relies on anyone else's clarity. This is the freedom that comes after the fallout. You don't live for reaction anymore. You don't move to keep others comfortable. You don't shrink to keep the peace. You expand quietly, confidently, without apology. You become your own reference point. And in doing so, you stop fearing who leaves when access ends. Because you now see what you never did before. Their leaving wasn't rejection. It was revelation. Asterisk, 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 the greatest return is not to a place or a person, it is to yourself. After boundaries have been drawn. After access has been revoked. After silence has revealed what words never could. What comes next is not revenge, not vindication, not performance, it's rebuilding. Quietly, intentionally. Without explanation, because after so much of your life has been shaped around accommodating others. Choosing yourself does not feel like comfort at first. It feels like disorientation. When you are no longer surviving on approval, routine, or emotional labor, your world grows quiet. That silence, for a while, can feel like emptiness. But soon, you realize, it's not emptiness. It's space. Space to ask questions you were too busy to consider. Space to explore desires that were muted by obligation. Space to grieve the versions of yourself you had to become in order to survive others' expectations. Space to build. Not just externally but internally, because true healing is not about what you gain, it's about what you recover. You recover your voice. Not the version that was shaped by politeness, fear, or the need to be chosen, but the one that speaks truth without tremble. The one that no longer waits to be invited to speak. The one that no longer lowers itself to fit into shallow rooms. You recover your instincts. The ones you once overrode in order to stay connected. The ones that warned you when something felt off. The ones that told you who was safe and who wasn't. The ones you finally start listening to without shame. You recover yourself, not the kind rooted in outcomes, but the kind grounded in resilience. You remember that you can survive discomfort without sacrificing yourself. That you can say no without explaining. That you can change without permission. That you can lose people and not lose your center, and perhaps most importantly, you recover your definition of love. No longer do you accept love that asks you to shrink. No longer do you confuse loyalty with emotional servitude. No longer do you romanticize suffering as proof of care. You now understand that love without respect is not love. That attention without consistency is not presence. That generosity without boundaries is not strength, it's depletion. This return to self doesn't happen all at once. It is slow, subtle, often lonely, but with every small act of self-honoring, you rebuild the foundation others chipped away at. You start to choose people who match your peace, not your pain. You build habits that reinforce your wholeness. You create rituals that nourish your center. And in doing so, you stop waiting for the life you deserve, you begin living it. Rebuilding begins not with action, but with awareness. A slow internal acknowledgement that for far too long, your life was shaped around what others expected from you. Not what you needed, not what you loved, not what brought you alive. What made you acceptable? What kept things quiet? What earned you approval? When you stop performing for belonging, the space you enter is unfamiliar. You're no longer chasing applause. You're no longer adjusting your tone to avoid discomfort. You're no longer reducing your truth to make it digestible for people who never asked for it. And in that unfamiliarity, something rare begins to emerge. Emotional honesty. You begin to tell the truth, not just to others, but to yourself. You admit that some of what you called peace was really silence. That what you named strength was actually that what you excused as just how they are was emotional harm you absorbed in the name of survival. You see clearly now. Not with anger, but with accuracy. You realize how many versions of yourself were created in response to other people's inability to love you as you were, and that clarity becomes your compass. You no longer need to argue with the past. You no longer wish it was different. You simply refuse to repeat it. And in that refusal, you begin to reframe everything. You no longer seek love that costs you your voice. You no longer pursue validation from those who dismissed you. You no longer negotiate your boundaries to keep temporary peace. Instead, you begin choosing alignment over acceptance. Alignment is quiet. It does not beg. It does not chase. It does not try to fit into spaces where truth is too loud. Alignment simply is. You begin making decisions that don't require permission. You start building rituals that ground you. You protect your energy with the same care you once used to protect others' comfort. And slowly, your identity becomes rooted not in how others define you, but in how you define yourself when no one is watching. You're no longer shaped by other people's needs. You're no longer emotionally outsourced. You stop viewing boundaries as walls and start seeing them as invitations for the right people. The right peace, the right purpose. There's a discipline in returning to yourself. After being pulled in so many directions for so long, it means noticing every place you once abandoned yourself just to feel safe. Every relationship that taught you to stay silent to keep the love intact. Every moment where your instincts whispered, but you listened to fear instead. But now, fear no longer gets to lead. You lead with truth, with intuition, with inner stillness that no longer depends on external validation. Your worth is not up for debate. Your peace is not open for negotiation. Your values are not bendable to make someone else stay. This is what rebuilding looks like, not just in what you do, but in what you no longer tolerate. You stop pretending to be okay with conversations that feel like emotional labor. You leave rooms where your soul feels starved. You release people who only came around when they needed something. You unsubscribe from narratives that require you to remain small in order to be accepted. Your silence becomes intentional, not passive. You no longer explain your absence to people who never asked why you were silent before. You no longer translate your boundaries into a softer language just to appear nice. You understand now that kindness is not the same as self-sacrifice, that compassion doesn't require self-erasure, that love, when healthy, expands you, it does not dilute you. And as your internal life stabilizes, your external life begins to shift. You find yourself drawn to people who don't want to fix you or use you but witness you. People who ask how you're doing and mean it. People who see your boundaries not as a threat but as a map to respecting you. People who don't need your pain to be visible in order to validate your healing. These connections are quieter, but deeper, less performative, more present. They don't ask you to prove your value, they recognize it. They don't withdraw when you assert yourself, they meet you there. They don't view your solitude as distance, they trust it as part of your rhythm. And you realize, this is what a life of your own feels like. Not a life reactive to what was done to you. Not a life built in rebellion, but one built in remembrance. A life that remembers who you were before you were shaped by expectation. A life that does not exist to be understood by everyone but to be lived fully by you. That kind of life is not built overnight. It's built choice by choice, thought by thought, boundary by boundary. And with each step, you grow less attached to being liked and more committed to being whole. Because now you know. The cost of access is too high if it costs you yourself.